This is the Homestead Journey Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the pursuit of self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and sustainability. Hey there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Homestead Journey Podcast. This is episode number 82 of the podcast. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me here on the Homestead Journey. My name is Brian Wells. I am coming to you from 3B Farm and Homestead here in beautiful upstate New York. And what have we been doing here on the Homestead this week? Well, let's head right on over to this week's Homestead happenings, and I will bring you up to date with everything we've been doing here on 3B Farm and Homestead. So this week, it has been garden. And that's probably going to be the theme of this podcast over the next several weeks as we're really getting into that season here on the homestead where things are warming up and we're getting up to that average last frost date here in our zone. And so we're going to be able to really get into planting all of the things. This week, I did pop into the feed store and get my seed potatoes and onion sets. I actually probably could get those planted, I think, technically starting tomorrow. It's been a little wet, a little cool over the last week, so I think I'm going to hold off a few days on getting those planted just because I don't want them to rot. But so excited about that coming up. But as far as what I've been doing here this week, a lot of it has been really topping off those garden beds with the soil that I had brought in last week. And so yesterday I was able to finish up getting those garden beds topped off, and I got the majority of the markers down. And what I mean by that is I have screws down my raised beds every foot. And then what I do is I use baling twine tied from screw to screw to mark 1 foot marks on down my bed. And then I actually use my drip irrigation to mark my middle, shall we say, lines so that I actually have square feet in my garden bed. So if you're curious as to how that looks, head on over to Instagram or Facebook. There's pictures there of how I do that. And I just put some more up this week. So check that out. But I was excited to get that done and then jump right into planting. So yesterday, I did get carrots and beets planted and wanted to get a few other things planted, but kind of ran out of time. And today was Mother's Day. And so I just took the day off, spent it with my wife, with my mom. And it's just a privilege to be able to do that. There were many, many years where I wasn't unable to spend Mother's Day with my mother because of just life circumstances. For quite a number of years, we were on separate continents. My mom and dad were missionaries to Brazil. My wife and I were in the Cayman Islands. And so on Mother's Day, it was a phone call. And so I certainly do not take for granted the opportunity that I have to spend with my mom today. And so I certainly wanted to avail myself of that. And it was wonderful to do that. We actually had a wonderful meal together. My dad and I cooked the meal. We did some steaks on the grill, some asparagus fresh from their garden. My dad made a most wonderful and delicious potato salad, Brazilian style potato salad. I absolutely loved it. It's made with mixed vegetables and it's just wonderful. We had some corn that we put up last year. So it wasn't all from the homestead, but we did buy the beef from a local meat shop. And so anyhow, it was just wonderful. A great way to spend the day with them. But anyhow, back to the garden. My radishes and peas are up and looking quite fabulous. The radishes actually need to be thinned. So I do need to drag my keister out there and get those thinned. I'm not sure when I'll get to that because I want to get other things planted, but got to also tend to what you already have underway. So maybe tomorrow evening I'll get some radishes thinned out. My wife and I yesterday spent some time potting on tomatoes. So that grand experiment that I've had where I was rooting tomatoes in water, I got around to actually potting on some more of those. I think I've potted on everything that I'm going to pot on. I have a whole bunch of Amish paste tomatoes that I could pot on, but I just don't think I'm going to do that. Just time and space reasons. I think I'm going to discard them, and it's going to be what it's going to be. On to our animals. Unfortunately, this year, we have really seen a high loss as far as our meat birds go. We really haven't changed much with regards to our approach to raising our meat birds, but we have experienced a high number of losses, and my dad has as well. And the only thing that has really changed is the fact that we ordered from a different hatchery. So I think I'm going to go back to my old hatchery next year. But unfortunately, this week I buried, I think, 4 or 5 meat birds that just died. The one we didn't think was going to make it. It seemed like it had some leg problems. It wasn't getting around very well, but the other ones seemed to be healthy. And then all of a sudden, boom, they were gone. So that's very, very unfortunate, but it is what it is. As my buddy Dave says, if you have livestock, eventually you're going to have dead stock. And so that's been our experience this week. On a happy note, my son's favorite chicken, the one that I allowed him to keep from last year, her name is Sweet Pea. She went broody. And today on Mother's Day, so what an exciting time, but the chicks started hatching out. And so very exciting to see that. Those are actually barnyard crosses that are going to go to my dad. And we actually have a leghorn that has gone broody, which is kind of odd. Leghorns generally don't like to go broody. Buff Orpingtons, which is what Sweet Pea is, do still have a tendency to go broody. Leghorns generally don't, but this one wants to set. So we're going to put a few more eggs underneath her, let her set, see what she hatches out, and then those can go up to my dad as well. Another animal happening that took place today that was unfortunate is my young boar, Boris, actually was able to get out of his pen and get in with my big boar, Bear. And they got into a bit of a scrap. Now, Bear ended up getting the better end of the deal, I think, from the standpoint of chasing Boris out, but he did get cut up pretty bad. And so I was out there just a little bit ago with some iodine, and I got Boris located back to where he was supposed to be. At the point that I got out there, he actually was out of Bear's pen, but somewhere along the line, I think he got into something he shouldn't have got into, and I don't know what it was. But when I put him in the pen with his girlfriend, Basil, he ate, because I used feed to kind of attract him back to where he was supposed to be. Again, follow the bucket, get your pigs bucket trained. But then all of a sudden he started puking. And so I don't know if he was still worked up from the fight or if he got into something that he wasn't supposed to get into. We don't really keep anything around that he shouldn't be allowed to get into. So I'll just keep an eye on him and see what happens. But it is what it is. And unfortunately, sometimes those things happen. Before we jump on over to this week's Charting the Course, I did want to provide you with a bit of a podcast update. In case you missed it, this past Friday, we launched our new series called 5-Minute Fridays. That's a new series that I'm launching that's going to come out on Fridays, as the name implies. And my goal is to tackle a topic or a question in 5 minutes or less. So thus the name 5-Minute Fridays. This is something that I've been thinking about doing for quite a while, and I just really wasn't quite sure when to launch it. Initially, I thought about calling it Motivational Mondays, but I thought, well, Brian, you're already releasing your regular episode on Mondays. It doesn't really make sense to put it out on Mondays. And then when I was privileged enough to be on Farmer Fridays with Greg Peterson over at Urban Farm Podcast, it kind of clicked. And I got to thinking, the majority of your listeners are people who work regular 9-to-5 jobs. And the weekend is when they have time to dedicate to this thing that we call homesteading. So why not drop that episode on Fridays and give them that boost of encouragement and inspiration to really take that next step on their homesteading journey. So keep an eye out for those. They will be released every Friday. And my goal is to tackle a topic in 5 minutes or less. And so if you have a question that you would like to have answered, something that you would like to have be a part of that show, reach out to me, Brian@thehomesteadjourney.net, and I will get it in the queue and we'll have some fun with that. Now, one of the benefits of being a member of the supporting listeners program of this podcast is that those members actually receive access to that episode a day early. So that comes out on Thursday for members of the Homestead Journey Supporting Listeners program. If you're interested in that, head on over to support.thehomesteadjourney.net for more information. If you sign up during the month of May and use the promo code May10, May10, then you will receive 10% off your membership costs. So support.thehomesteadjourney.net for more information on that. Before I head on over to this week's Charting the Course, I did want to provide some additional commentary with regards to last week's episode. I'm not sure this is a mea culpa or it's an example of I was wrong and I need to offer a correction. I'm just going to call this additional information that I did not have before I recorded last week's episode. And this really surrounds the quality of battery-powered implements like chainsaws, push mowers, weed whackers, leaf blowers, etc. As I was doing research into last week's episode, the research that I was running across with regards to the quality of those implements was not favorable. And my personal experience with those things has not been favorable. And so as I went into it, I certainly was not trying to misspeak or I was certainly not trying to offer misinformation. I was basing my commentary based on, again, personal experience and anecdotal evidence that I was reading on the web. But a couple of buddies of mine, and you know them, Don Bradner from Little Mountain Life and Jack Polner, who has been on this podcast from the Mindful Homestead, reached out to me with a little bit of information. Jack, as you may recall, was a salesperson for a company that provided PPE to arborists. So he's very well connected to that realm. And Don is someone who is a huge fan, almost we'll put him in fanboy category of Ryobi tools. And he has recent Ryobi tools that are battery powered. He actually has a chainsaw, a weed whacker, and a push mower that are of the 40 volt variety. And he says that the quality of those tools have come a long way in the last couple of years. And Jack's feedback was also very similar, that the quality of chainsaws that are battery powered have come a long way in the last couple of years. And there are some arborists that are now starting to go in that direction. Now, as I was preparing for last week's episode, I was basing my opinion on the information that I had found on the web, anecdotal information, my dad's experience with some battery powered equipment, and it was not favorable. This week, I actually reached out to some friends of mine for additional information. One particular friend is an arborist. My brother is somebody who heated with wood for years, and so has used all kinds of chainsaws. And the information that I got from them was a little bit mixed. My one friend, they have some battery powered weed whackers and so forth that they absolutely love. My brother is not a fan to this day of battery powered chainsaws. So I say all of that to say this. I don't want to leave anybody with an incorrect impression or bad information. Do your research into those tools and those implements. I may have been a little too harsh on them. According to Don and to Jack, they have come a long way in a short period of time. And so they may work very well for homesteaders. I do still stand by my underlying principle that it should be up to the consumer to choose what they can and cannot use on their homestead. And I do feel like regulations like this do force us into a direction that makes it more difficult for us to be able to raise and grow our own food. I have not looked this week to find out if there are battery powered rototillers or battery powered riding lawnmowers that last very long. Don did reference a push lawnmower that is battery powered that he's had great success with. but both a rototiller and a riding lawnmower, as I understand it, would be banned underneath the California laws. And so that does concern me. But anyhow, I just wanted to provide that clarification. I don't know if that's helpful or hurtful or if that muddies the water anymore, but I certainly want to be above board. I do try to do as much research into a topic as I can for the show. I certainly don't have time to do hours and hours and hours and hours of research. But in this particular example, I actually did do quite a bit of research into this topic because I wanted to make sure that I got it right. And it seems like from a principle perspective, I got it right. From an informational perspective, maybe I was a little too harsh on battery powered equipment. So if you have any experience, good, bad, indifferent with regards to some of this, I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, brian@thehomesteadjourney.net. I'd love to hear what your experience has been. But again, at the end of the day, Don and Jack both say, you've come a long way, baby, when it comes to battery powered machinery. All right. Having said that, let's head on over to this week's Charting the Course. On this week's Charting the Course, I am so excited to be joined by not one, but two special guests. First, making her full episode podcast debut is none other than my lovely wife, Bonnie Wells. Now, she did join me for a small segment back on episode number 76 when I kind of confessed to my mistake of having locked her in the chicken coop. But today she joins me for this entire episode as we talk to Deborah Niemann from thriftyhomesteader.com. Now, Deborah is the author of several books, including Homegrown and Homemade and Raising Goats Naturally. She is also the host of the podcast For the Love of Goats. And so with that said, Deborah, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So before we jump into the main topic today of goats, and you've got my lovely wife here joining me, who is, we'd say, an avowed goat hater, but we're going to see what we can do to maybe change her perspective. But before we jump into that, could you just tell me a little bit about your homestead and where you're located?
Well, we moved here in 2002 from the Chicago suburbs, and we're about 100 miles from the city now. And I say we were clueless city slickers because I really thought, people have been doing all this stuff since the beginning of time. So how hard could it be? You throw some seeds in the ground, come back a few months later, harvest dinner. You have animals running around out there providing you with eggs and milk, and they just do what they do. And most people thought we were crazy and thought that it was going to be a lot harder. And the truth I always say is somewhere in the middle. There's no way that it was as easy as I thought it was going to be. But it's definitely not as hard as most people think that it's going to be.
And so 2002, that's a while ago. That's kind of before homesteading became cool.
Yeah, it was a long time. It's crazy. I feel like we're newcomers to all this, and we're approaching 20 years now, which just doesn't seem like I'm old enough for that to be possible. But yeah, it was not a thing at all in 2002. And so all of our suburban friends really thought we had lost our mind. They thought we were going through some early midlife crisis or something. And they all thought that we were going to be, turning tail and running back to the suburbs within 2 or 3 years after we realized what a mess we had gotten ourselves into. And although it was a lot harder than I expected it to be, I just got more determined. The more problems we had, I just wanted to figure out, well, what are we doing wrong? How do we fix this? So we stuck it out.
So what was kind of the catalyst that got you moving in the direction of homesteading?
I always tell people it was a really long road. It was about a 13, 14 year progression. And it all started when I got pregnant with my first child, because when I was growing up, I was sick all the time. And it wasn't until I was pregnant with my first child that I heard anything about the connection between your diet and your health. And I was really surprised by that. I was like, wow, really? So like if my children eat less processed food and have a healthier diet, they're not going to be sick all the time like I was as a child. And it turned out to be true. I started reading labels, we started cooking from scratch, we stopped buying processed foods, we decided to have a garden. We just started doing things really incrementally, and at one point we said that we wanted to move to the country and start growing our own food organically. And we did that because it wasn't a popular thing back then. To get organic food, you had to go to health food stores and you paid a lot of money for it, or you had to join a co-op. And, we would have this big semi truck pulling up in front of our house every month with cases of all of these organic products that we would buy. And then we had a little garden in our backyard, and I thought about chickens, and then I read a book about chickens and I got freaked out because I was afraid they were going to give my children lice, which is not even a possibility, but
Right.
that's what I got from reading that book. And so I
Right.
was like, oh, can't do that. And so we just kept, and we started looking, and we could never quite find what we were looking for, because in Illinois, so many places in the country are just a couple acres cut out of a cornfield. And I didn't want that. I wanted trees, and I wanted a pond or a creek or something, which now I hate the creek because it floods. But, again, that was one of my clueless city slicker ideas, was like, oh, because we got a creek, and they say, be careful what you wish for.
Right.
And,
Right.
ugh.
Now your homestead is, as I understand, is about 32 acres. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. And that was one of the big things that we figured out really quickly. Like, we thought we needed all this land to be more self-reliant, and we discovered very quickly that we didn't. Like, initially, we were using such a tiny piece of this property, and having so much land really just allowed us to get carried away and and just get more and more animals.
So it kind of goes back to be careful what you wish for. That's one of the
Exactly.
things that I tell people all the time is the danger. There's always a danger in homesteading of biting off more than you can chew. And I don't think that ever goes away. I don't care how long you've been doing this. There's always that, well, we can just fit in one more thing. We can just do one more thing. And when you have that much land, then that temptation just goes through the roof.
Yes. Yeah, so many people is like, "Oh, well, I only have 5 acres." And it's like, yeah, you're limited then by the amount of land you have. And with 32 acres, I mean, this is so much more land than what we need.
Mm-hmm. Right. One of the things that I found on your website, and if people are interested in checking it out, it's thriftyhomesteader.com is at least one of them. But in your about the author section, you said the first mistake we made was thinking that we had to move to the country to live a more sustainable lifestyle. But I'm here now and loving it, and I'm not leaving. But the good news for you is that you can get started where you are, whether you live in a condo or a cabin. You can live a healthier, more sustainable life. And that just absolutely resonates with me. That's the heart of this podcast, is just getting people to understand that they don't have to wait to start their homesteading journey.
Yeah, and that's one of the things too, because I teach classes and get emails from people and stuff, and I hear from so many people who say, "Oh, I want to do that when I retire." And we started doing this when I was 39 years old, and I am 58 now, and there is such a huge difference between what I could do when I was 39 and what I can do now. And just how easy it is. Like 7 years ago, I stepped in a hole when I was walking through the pasture and threw my back out and was incapacitated for weeks. And
Mhm.
another time I smashed my knee and was laying in bed for weeks with my knee the size of a football, and watching baby goats give birth on the monitor with my husband out there, not knowing what he was doing. And it was just I say I don't bounce like I used to.
No doubt.
So I really encourage people, like, go for it sooner rather than later.
Right. And the thing about it is, if you start learning the skills on a small scale, then as you know, if you have the opportunity to get the 5 to 10 to 15, 20 acres of land in the country, then you can scale up. But you're not having to, at the time that you're having to learn how to manage all of this property, also learn how to do all of these skills while you are implementing infrastructure and perhaps getting animals for the first. I mean, it just, to a certain extent, you just become very, very overwhelmed very quickly. And so if you can start small and then scale on up, I think that's just the best way for people to have success doing this.
Yeah. And when I was working on my first book, Homegrown and Handmade, I went to the city of Chicago to visit people who had chickens. And because I was in the Chicago chicken group, and I was just absolutely amazed and felt so inadequate that people in the city of Chicago were doing so much with these tiny little postage stamp backyards. There are people in the city of Chicago that have a garden and chickens and ducks and goats. And there's one family I interviewed. They live in an apartment, and on the roof of their apartment, they have raised beds, bees, and chickens, and they make their own beer. And I came home and I said, I feel so inadequate. Like, we should be doing so much more.
Absolutely. It is amazing what people can do if they get creative and think outside the box. One of the examples that I give, I read about a family in Australia that they had. Now, I've not been to their homestead, so I can't verify this. All I can do is go by their word. But they said that they had an 800 square foot backyard, and from that backyard, they were raising over 80% of their food. They were getting creative. They were doing succession planning, vertical gardening. They were bartering with other homesteaders to, maybe get some of the things that they couldn't produce themselves. But 800 square feet isn't a lot of room. And yet they were doing all of, raising all of this food. So I think that whether people, maybe they can't raise 80% of their food, but they can raise 10 or 20%, or maybe it's just the herbs. But I think anybody can do something. And so it's just a matter of just getting that creativity in your head. And some people look at what they don't have. And my challenge to people is, look at what you have and what can I do with what I have?
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people think that they need a lot of land to have goats. And the reality is you really don't, because if you're only going to get a couple of goats, like, you can get livestock panels that are 16 feet long. And so you've got 16 feet by 16 feet. And you can put 2 or 3 Nigerian dwarfs in there during the day, take them back to the barn at night, and every 2 or 3 days, move that 16 by 16 foot pen. And you will actually have healthier goats than somebody who just sticks their goats out in a pasture and forgets about them, and is not doing rotational grazing. So sometimes, when people, like you said, get creative, sometimes when people don't have big spaces, they are much more productive and make better choices.
Yes.
Because so many people think, like, oh, I'm just going to have one big pen and put all the goats out there. And then in a couple of years, you have goats dying from parasites because they're eating out of their toilet.
Yeah. Yes. Great point. And since we've pivoted to goats, great segue there. So we're going to focus on goats today, because goats is an area where we have no expertise. I have never raised goats. And my lovely wife here is an avowed goat hater. I should say goat hater. That's probably a bit of a strong.
No.
She thinks they're cute. She just doesn't want them. So I guess let's start by talking about why people might want to have goats on their homestead. Why is that a choice that people might want to make?
Well, just starting with the very simplest things, a lot of people will just get a couple of wethers, which is what they call castrated males, just to clear brush, or as pets, or to play with the grandkids when they come over. And then sometimes they're like, oh, this has been really fun. Let's get a couple of does that can have babies and we will start milking them. And that was why we got goats. It all started with goat cheese for me because I loved goat cheese. But, back, I don't know how, I have no idea how much it costs now because I've been making my own for almost 20 years. But back then it was a little 5-ounce container cost $5, which definitely meant that it was not an everyday thing. This was like a special occasion treat. And so I wanted goats just so I could make Chev because I just thought it was the most delicious cheese in the world. So we got 3 does so that we could do that. And then when I got the cheese making book, I learned that Chev was just the tip of the iceberg. You can make yogurt and buttermilk and cheddar and really any kind of cheese you can make with goat milk. And so at this point, we've made 18 different kinds of cheese. The only dairy product that we buy, that we have bought like in 15, 16 years is butter, because you can make butter from goat milk, but it doesn't taste like butter. It doesn't have
Right.
that creamy taste that we're used to with the cow's milk butter. And so because I made it a few times and I was like, just not a fan of goat butter. Like every other goat product out there, I absolutely love it. The meat is fantastic. Goat meat is somewhere in between beef and lamb. It is not, this flavor is not as strong as lamb. And
Mhm.
I personally feel like beef is kind of a strong flavor too.
Mhm.
Goat is just not a very strong flavor at all, which is why I love it. I think it's really, really great. And it also is like the lowest cholesterol of any meat. It's has lower cholesterol than even like the dark chicken meat.
Oh, wow.
So it's like on par with chicken breast. It's really very healthy, very delicious.
So I love goat. We lived in the Cayman Islands for a while, and we would go to this restaurant every week, and one of the things I got was the West Indian mix, which was curried goat, oxtail, and cow foot. And I would just tell them, hold the cow foot. I want more of the curried goat and the oxtail. I absolutely love. I love goat. I think it's just delicious. Have you ever had goat? Did you have it when I?
No, but I'd be willing to try it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So let's back up just a little bit here. Goat terminology. So in the land of pigs, we would have a boar, which is an intact male, a barrow, which is a cut male, a gilt, which is a female that has not been bred, and then or has not farrowed yet, and then a sow is a female that has had piglets.
Mhm.
So in goat speak, then you have your doe would be your female.
Mhm.
Do they differentiate between a young female, a female that's not been bred, and a female that has been bred, or not?
Not that, but a baby doe is called a doeling, and a
Okay.
baby buck is called a buckling.
Okay. And
And
then
then
a cut male is you said it was a wether.
mhm,
Okay. And then an intact male is
a buck.
a buck. Okay.
Yes.
So now we refer to billy goats. Is that kind of vernacular of a buck, or is that something different, or?
Yeah, billy goat and nanny goat are just like old fashioned slang terms.
Okay. So for Billy would be an intact male slang. Nanny is a female, and then doe would be the more
The
sophisticated.
correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sophisticated.
We think of them as the correct terms is buck, doe, buckling, doeling, and a wether.
So now, obviously, meat, milk are two benefits of having goats, and then using them to do work on your property. I love that. Using chickens, using pigs. I've heard people say if you want to clear a piece of land, send in the goats first, follow them up with the pigs, and then follow them up with the chickens. And that pretty much will clear a piece of property for you to really start working it.
Yeah.
So I love that idea of utilizing goats to do the work. But goats also can be used for other purposes. And I'm thinking more along the lines of like Angora goats, right? For their wool. Is it called
Yes.
wool?
Angora goats produce mohair.
Mohair, okay.
Yeah. And so Angora goats are definitely another possibility if somebody is a fiber fanatic. And you can also get cashmere goats, which cashmere is really funny because it's not a breed. Specifically, they are just goats that have been bred to have a lot of cashmere. All goats look really fuzzy in the winter because all of them grow a thick coat of cashmere underneath. And then in the spring, they blow their coat so they look kind of moth-eaten as all this cashmere is working its way out. And I've never saved the cashmere, but if you do, you have to separate it from the hair, which is the thing that's always turned me off. But when you see how little cashmere goats actually produce, that's why a cashmere sweater is so expensive.
Gotcha. So what about is there any other I guess uses of goat that I haven't really talked about besides those? Is there any other?
Also leather and skins. So I don't like to waste anything. So when we have goats butchered, we ask for the skins back and then I send them to a tannery to have them turned into leather.
Oh, okay. And then what about goat manure? I know.
Oh yeah.
goat manure it's more like rabbit manure in its consistency. From the standpoint of for those who are familiar with rabbits, that would be more like that, less like pig or cow or anything like that, chicken. Is goat manure something that you can put onto a garden like you can rabbit manure right away, or does it have to age before you use it, or should you use it? Kind of what's the thoughts there?
According to USDA organic standards, if you put raw manure from any animal on your garden, it has to be put in place at least 90 days before you harvest any above ground crops and 120 days before you harvest root crops. So like if you put it on carrots, you couldn't harvest those carrots for 120 days. We use it on our fruit trees and under our trees. Because we usually clean out our barn twice a year. And that is done in the spring when the trees are just blossoming. And then in the fall after we harvest the fruit. And it works really great because all of the straw is mixed in there. So the straw acts as mulch. And then you've got the little goat berries in there. And as it rains, it's like creating, natural manure tea for you to fertilize the fruit trees. And so that's one instance where we use it fresh. Otherwise, we compost it in the garden before we use it.
And I know with most more, rabbit is one that people will say you can use on a garden hot, so to speak. And other manures, if you were to try to use it, even if we were going with the time limits, they're so strong, a lot of times they'll just burn your plants if you were to use them before composting them. So as far as when you are keeping them indoors in the winter time, and do you use kind of like a deep litter method with them? So you're just adding straw and shavings, or?
Yes, basically we use straw because we found that it's warmer than shavings. And plus in Illinois, it's cheaper. If some people live like on the East Coast, near sawmills and stuff, getting shavings might be cheaper for them, but we're in the middle of wheat country. And so the straw is much cheaper. It costs me $5 to bed a stall with straw, whereas back when we were using shavings 17, 18 years ago, still, it was like $12 to bed a stall. And
Yeah.
I'm sure it's much more now, but I haven't bought shavings in so long. I don't know.
So definitely an example of use the resources that you have available to the best of your ability. So milking goats, do you milk by hand or do you have a milking machine?
We do both. So a lot of people think that they're going to save a lot of time with a milking machine, but there is cleanup involved. In fact, we did not have a milking machine. We were milking, got all the way up to 21 goats before we bought a milking machine. And my daughter, who was a teenager back then, was all excited about the milking machine. And the first time I used it, I said, okay, so if you're going to use it, this is what you have to do to clean it. And I'm showing her how you got to clean the tubes and the inflations and all this stuff. And she's like watching me. And she's like, you got to be kidding me. I'm not doing that. And so she just kept milking by hand, because then it's like you stick the bucket in the dishwasher and that's the extent of the cleanup,
Right.
Otherwise, you've also got the setup, so you've got to take everything out to the barn. You've got to hook it up, you've got to hook up the bucket to the machine and then attach it to the goat and then clean it up afterwards. And in my case, I'm getting wimpy in my old age here. After about 5 or 6 goats, my arms feel like they're going to fall off. So that is my limit. If there's going to be more than about 5 goats to milk, especially if they're pretty fresh, meaning that, early in their lactations, they're going to have a lot of milk. And I'm going to have to be milking one goat for, 5 minutes, rather than later in lactation where it'll only be 2 or 3 minutes per goat. I'm going to take the machine out there because I'm just wimpy like that.
So how many goats do you currently have?
We currently have about 20 does, and I only have 2 bucks at the moment, which is like, I think that's less bucks than I have ever had after the first year I owned goats. But that's okay, because I'm going to be keeping a couple of baby bucks this year. And probably buying a new one too, just to bring in a little extra blood or new blood. But I haven't bought any does since 2005 because I always want to keep my own babies. I know their bloodlines, and so we have a lot of goats here that are 5, 6, 7 generations. Like I bought their great grandmother back in 2002 or 3.
And you have Nigerian dwarf goats, correct?
Yes.
So now are they primarily a milking breed, or are they kind of considered a dual purpose breed? I mean, I know you can eat any of them. But are they considered more of a dual purpose, or are they considered more primarily a milking breed?
They're a dairy breed for sure. That's the difference really between them and a pygmy. If you look at the body type, a pygmy is much meatier, whereas the Nigerian has that finer bone, a lot less muscle, like Alpines and Saanens. And if you want to translate to cows, they're more like the Jerseys than the Angus.
So yours are Nigerian dwarf goats, and you have registered stock. Are yours so purebred Nigerian dwarf goats? And pretty much you've maintained, I wouldn't necessarily call it a closed herd, but you have not been bringing in a lot of external genetics. So having multiple bucks then helps you keep from getting too inbred. Is that kind of the idea there?
Yeah. And it is technically considered, I just learned this in doing my podcast on Scrapey, when I interviewed somebody from the USDA. My herd would be considered a closed herd, because I have not brought in any new does since 2005.
Okay.
All I have ever bought is bucks, and think since I've bought, I think 4 or 5 bucks since 2005. And I make sure that they come from herds that have tested negative for all of the diseases like CAE, Yonis, and CL for years. And you can request to see the test results for that also. And that is really, really important to make sure that you're getting animals, because CAE, CL, and Yonis do not have symptoms when they're in the early stages. And if somebody knows they have a goat with one of those diseases, they're probably going to sell them like at the sale barn or Craigslist or something like that for $50, $75. And new people who don't realize that you can't necessarily tell your goat is healthy or has one of these diseases just by looking, they buy them and bring them home. And then, a year or two down the road, when they've brought in more goats, all of a sudden now this goat is sick. It's losing weight. They can't figure out why, or it gets this massive abscess under its jaw, or its knees swell up. And then they find out it has this incurable disease and needs to be put down. And in the case of some of these diseases like Yonis and CL, like if a CL abscess bursts, the pus that comes out of there can infect all the other goats that come in contact with it. Yonis is transmitted fecal oral. So that goat is out there pooping in your pasture and leaving the bacterium in the grass, and it can survive for 5 years. So for 5 years, you cannot, and that disease is transmissible to all ruminants. So for 5 years, you would not be able to bring any sheep, goats, cows, llamas, any of those animals onto your pasture.
Wow. So some of the most common diseases then that affect goats is Yonis. The other one you said was CL.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other diseases that they're kind of apt to get?
CAE is another one, which is caprine arthritis encephalitis. And that was one actually that was really, really bad in the US, like in the 70s and 80s. They actually discovered that about 70% of goats in the US had that.
Wow.
And so this is why this is where we have goats got the horrible, horrible reputation for fencing. Because the answer to that was basically the only way to eradicate that was to take all the babies away from the moms at birth. If a mom had that disease, you had to take her babies away at birth and bottle feed them either pasteurized milk or milk replacer, because the disease is transmitted primarily through milk. It can also be transmitted through blood and semen, but milk is the most common way that it's transmitted. And so you had, for like a 30-year period there, you had pretty much all the dairy goats in this country being bottle fed. And when you bottle feed baby goats, they think you're mommy. And, everybody who's new to goats thinks, oh, bottle babies are so cute. And if you happen to have a child in your house, they're going to just really be over the top. My daughter was 9 when we moved out here. My youngest was 9, and she thought she had to have a baby goat in her bedroom every spring. And one year she wound up with 5 baby goats in her bedroom. And when it was time for them to go out and live in the pasture like real goats, they found every imaginable escape route that you could. I mean, just so far beyond my wildest dreams, like, how did they get out again? How did they get out again? And even, I remember one time I had a bottle baby that I was selling to somebody, and I told her, I said, this kid is I'm just going to warn you, this kid is going to give you a run for your money. I have not had one this bad about getting out in years. And she's like, oh, no problem. We got Fort Knox here. A couple days after she picked that kid up, she emailed and said, I can't believe all the places she found to escape.
Wow.
Because that's one of the big things that people don't like about goats is they say they're too hard to keep fenced in. But the reality is, if you've got the wrong fencing for any animal, they're hard to keep fenced in. I personally find pigs much harder to keep fenced in than goats. Because with goats, pretty much if they're raised by mom, they've got a really strong herd instinct. Like when they're little, they want to stay with mom. And once they get older, they just want to stay with the herd. They're not interested in getting out. But those bottle babies, they see you on the other side of the fence and they're like, mommy. And then they find places to escape that you never expected.
Never thought would happen. So one of your objections to getting goats is that, right?
What, bottle feeding?
No, well, or the fencing. The
Oh,
fencing.
that they get out all the time?
Mhm.
Yes. Yes. I've heard that they get out all the time. And then when they get out, they start eating everything in sight.
Yes, because they do. They're browsers. And that, I answer some really funny questions sometimes from people. And there are a lot of people who think, oh, I could just put a couple goats in my backyard and they'll be happy, right? And I'm like, do you got any rose bushes or daylilies or, like all those things are totally edible to goats. You have a hedge, like they would love to eat a hedge, they love bushes. And people are so funny, There was a guy one time that's like, you can't teach them to not eat that. And I'm like, that's their natural diet.
Right. Right. And my guess is they would prefer that to grass, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So keeping them in is one of your concerns. What's another one of your concerns with regards to getting goats?
Well, I think one of my reasons why I don't want goats is when I was young, and this would have been probably late 80s. I remember that I don't remember that it was a goat. My dad says we had goats. I don't remember any of the goats. I should have been old enough to know we had goats, but I said I remembered bottle feeding this animal. And my dad said, yeah, it was a goat and his name was Billy. And so I said, Dad, like, what happened to Billy? And my dad said, we ate Billy. And I said, okay, so maybe that has something to do with, like, maybe I got traumatized. And like, I forgot that we totally had goats. I don't want anything to do with goats, yeah. But for me, like, goats is just one more thing to do. They're a lot of work for one animal. You got to milk them. The milking part, you can't like just feed them and leave them, like we do. We don't have to milk any of our, other animals. So that would add, another thing to do.
Yeah. So the question is, how much do you want goat milk and goat cheese? It's really funny because initially goats was totally women's work on this farm. It was me and my two daughters. We were the ones who took care of the goats. If I needed a new fence or a new building or a new door cut in the big barn, I would say to my husband, can you do this? And he would do it. And, we had goats giving birth and he'd be walking through the barn going, how's it going? And we're like, great, got a couple of does. And he's like, great. And he just keep walking, I used to, in fact, on our website, I had a joke that's like, he doesn't know the difference between a pasture and a pastern. And which is true. Like when he saw that, he goes, what is that? Like a pastern's the lower part of a goat's leg. And you know what a pasture is. But so it was pretty funny because our daughters grew up and decided to go away to college. And then I said, if you still want the goat cheese and the yogurt and all this kind of stuff, you're going to have to start helping because there will be times when I'm not home, like when it's time to milk the goats or, I'm just going to need help. And he totally was on board with that because he had gotten so addicted to the goat cheese and the yogurt and all that kind of stuff at that point that he was totally happy to get on board. And that is actually why we bought the milking machine, because he insisted that his hands were too big to milk by hand, which he now knows is not true. He can milk totally fine by hand. It's just a matter of technique. But that's okay. I mean, that's why we bought the milking machine, which makes my life easier also.
No, win-win.
Yeah.
So when you've got 20 does, around 20 does, you said,
Mhm.
how many of them are you currently milking? And generally speaking, how many do you milk at a time?
Now, since our girls are gone, our son is still here. So there's only 3 of us. So we don't need a lot of milk at this point. Right now, I think we're milking about 6. We do have some goats that are still left to kid, and we have some goats that are nursing kids. And that's one of the things too that I think is really important for people to realize is that twice a day milking thing that people talk about so much is not engraved in stone. There are ways to get around that. And one of them is simply by dam raising. And that's one reason that I felt so strongly about getting goats that were from herds that were tested negative for all these diseases, is because I wanted to be able to let the moms raise the babies, which in 2002 was like sacrilege. I mean, it's like most people would not, we were all in the Yahoo groups back then. Most people would not even admit in the Yahoo groups that they were dam raising babies, because people would just be like, oh, you don't care about your goats. You're just being lazy. You've got sick goats. I would never buy goats from you. And I'm like, they're all tested negative for all the diseases, you know. And dam raising is becoming a lot more popular now. But back then it wasn't at all, because so many people were still in that mindset, like we have to bottle raise all the kids to eradicate CAE. And which it's not eradicated, but honestly, I'm afraid that the numbers are going to be going up again, because so many new people getting into goats and not testing, and just buying them and bottle feeding, and buying them and letting them raise kids. You know, I get emails from people like, my goat has this big swollen abscess under her chin. What is it? And I'm like, you need to take it to the vet and get it tested, because like nothing, you know, like I don't have x-ray vision. I'm not psychic. You've got to get lab work to know if your animals have these diseases.
Speaking of veterinary care, what all do you have to do with a goat as far as care goes? You know, do you need to have it tested once a year for diseases? Do you need to deworm it? What about its hooves? All of those kinds of things. How do you kind of approach all of that?
The main thing you have to do really is just trim the hooves, and it varies tremendously based on the genetics. There are some goats whose hooves grow so fast you have to do it every month. There are other goats that you can do once every 6 months. I think about the longest any of my goats have ever gone is about a year. I know somebody who raises Kikos, which is a meat breed though. And that's one of the things that's like really important to her is that they have very either slow growing hooves or hooves that would just wear down naturally. And she said she like her favorite buck of all time only had to have his hooves trimmed once, because he's just really good at keeping them worn down, so that they didn't actually need trimming. The only vaccine that most people give goats is CDT. The C and the D are for enterotoxemia, and the T is for tetanus. And most people just give that themselves. You can buy that at any farm store. You can buy it online. Other than that, there's really not a lot. Pretty much almost all of my vet bills are for health certificates, which are required for interstate travel.
Yeah, same
You know,
way with us for the pigs. Yep.
Yeah. And goats, the thing about goats, because when we first got them, the first 5 years were an absolute nightmare. I did not have a buck who lived past the age of 3 for the first 5 years. I had does not getting pregnant, not staying pregnant, having miscarriages at all stages of pregnancy. Like we saw little toothpick kids that were born a month early and could obviously not survive, and things like that. It was really sad. And ultimately we realized that we had 2 problems. One was copper deficiency and the other one was parasites. We have come a long way in parasite research in the last 20 years. When I got started, we were pretty much doing everything wrong. You know, people were deworming on a schedule. They were deworming the whole herd at once. They were, you know, if one goat had worms, they all have worms. So you've got to deworm all of them. And what happened was that people started winding up with complete dewormer resistance. And that's what happened to us. None of the dewormers worked anymore. And so we were just sitting there watching goats die. And it was made worse by the fact that our goats were copper deficient. back then, a big part of that was that they did not have enough copper in goat feeds or in minerals. And when you combine our well water, which is high in sulfur and iron, which are copper antagonists, that just made the problem even worse.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but people knew very little about nutrition back then. You still, vets who went to school 20 years ago will still tell people copper deficiency is impossible, even though I can show you all of the liver tests. Like, I got all the lab work to prove it. I'm not just guessing here.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing, if somebody went to vet school 20 years ago, they're still going to be telling people to do all of these things that will cause dewormer resistance. So now, like, one of the biggest challenges is that there is so much information online. And unfortunately, nothing ever dies online. And a lot of this
Mhm.
information is like 20 years old, It's like, and unfortunately, there are people who, some of the most dangerous people out there are people who've been raising goats for 30 or 40 years. And they're sitting there going, I give my goats a dewormer every month and they're doing great. And that's why they're doing great. There's no such thing as dewormer resistance. And it's like, yeah, you live in Colorado. I've talked to vets in Colorado. You don't have worm problems there. So you've just been wasting your money for the last 30 years.
Mhm.
Like, your goats would be fine without your monthly deworming.
Mhm.
And that's the thing too. Like, if somebody's in like Colorado to Arizona, Utah, all those places, they're not going to have worm problems. Those of us, like in the Midwest down to the Southeast and along the East Coast, where we have like lots and lots of grass, lots of rain, that's like heaven for intestinal worms,
Mhm.
And so, like, we're the ones who have to know this. And it just drives me crazy that there's a lot of people out west still, that have been raising goats for a long time, who are put on their websites, there's no such thing as dewormer resistance. I would know. I've been raising goats for 30 or 40 years. You just got lucky that you live where you do.
Right. Yeah. So as far as when you trim the hooves, you do that yourself, or do you have somebody else do it? You do that yourself. So that's something that a homesteader would be able to do.
Yes.
And obviously, I'm sure it's a skill that people have to learn. It's not something that you just go out and it's not like trimming toenails.
It actually is a lot like trimming toenails.
Okay.
It's really, and that's what I tell people. And one of the things, like in my book about goats, that I do not have is this stupid drawing of a perfect hoof, which almost every other goat book out there has this drawing. This is what your hoof should look like after you've trimmed it. And just, I stress the word drawing, because like that is a perfect hoof that does not exist in nature. Okay. And when I got my first goats, I had that book sitting there. I had the hoof trimmers. I'm like, okay, it's supposed to look like that. I went whack and thought, oh my God, this goat is going to bleed to death, because I cut way, 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 way into the quick.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just like, it's like the dumbest thing in the world to tell somebody, like, make it look like that. No. So like, you have to, like, you just trim off the excess, just like your fingernails. Nobody's going to sit there and go, oh, look at this picture. I want to trim my nail to look just like the picture of the perfect fingernail. That is not the way we do it. Like, yeah, you just trim off the excess.
So I've kind of rabbit trailed a little bit off down that way, but I want to come back to milking. So one of your objections is the whole idea of milking. You don't want to. So with goats, as you said, generally speaking, people have this idea in their head about milking twice a day, morning, evening kind of milking. If you're doing dam raising, then in cow speak, people would talk about calf sharing. It's the same idea there, that the baby is drawing off the milk, and therefore it doesn't need to be milked as frequently. How long would you keep a buckling or a doeling on a doe before you wean them, or do they self wean, or how does that how does that happen?
So it depends on how many kids a doe has. If she has, since my husband got involved with this, he's an engineer. He's all about data. So when he got involved, he started weighing all of our kids. And now one of my pet peeves is people eyeballing kids and go, oh, they look fine. Because now I've got the data and I'm like, whoa, no, it's not about looking okay. So I have very strict parameters for like how much I want to see kids gain, because we saw a very direct correlation between if our kids gain at least 4 ounces a day, we do not have problems with coccidiosis and worms and stuff, because their nutritional plane is so high that it really helps to boost their immune system. And so if a doe has, if she has 1 kid, we do start milking right away, because otherwise you wind up with a very fat kid and a very low milk supply. It's really about supply and demand. And that little kid's going to give it his very best. He's going to demand as much as he can, and he's going to get big and fat and chunky, but that he's not going to be able to demand as much as 2 kids. And so I tell people, you are the twin that wasn't born, and you can do it however you want. We have played with the numbers over and over with multiple does, and we have really not found a difference in the amount of milk you get, whether you separate that kid overnight and milk in the morning, or whether you just go in there and milk twice a day without separating the kid. If she has 2, I am going to let her I'm not going to separate the kids at all. I'm going to let her nurse those kids. I will keep an eye on her udder. If her udder looks like it's getting full, we will milk it. Most goats, you just wind up with a couple of really great, healthy kids, Once in a while there will be a goat. We raised La Manchas for about 8 years, and I had some La Manchas that were just such massive producers that they needed to be milked when they were nursing twins, because they just produced more than the kids could consume. And the doe would have adjusted to that, but we make so much cheese. Like, we make all of our cheese, like all the cheddar, Gouda, mozzarella, everything. So we want all the milk. And so that's why, we would try to get the doe supply to go up as much as we could. And so once the kids are 2 months old, and now I would say once the kids weigh 20 pounds, we start separating them overnight, and milk the mom in the morning whenever we want milk. But, like if you want to, if you've got something that you need to do and you're, like, oh, I've got to be out by a certain time this morning, you don't have to milk that goat. You don't have to separate the kids overnight. You can just leave them with her and they'll take care of it for you. So once the kids are sold, so I actually kind of try to hold back a little on selling that last kid, because I like that flexibility. I like it that the kids can keep up the supply for us, and that if we're busy, we can skip a milking and the kid's gonna keep the milk flowing. My daughter, one time after she had gone off to college, my husband and I went on vacation, and she was here for a week. And she decided she wasn't going to milk anybody that had a kid on them. And we came back, and like all those goats, like their supplies had all like fell in half.
Wow.
I was so mad at her. I was like,
and
like,
once it falls, it's not going back up, right?
It's hard to get it to go back up. And that's another thing that that we've done too, is that because we've done extended lactations on goats where we've milked them for 2 or 3 years without breeding them again. The other thing is my husband teaches college, and so during the semesters, a lot of times he will drop back to once a day milking, where he's only milking them once a day. And when you do that, their supply usually doesn't get cut completely in half. It usually goes to about 70% of what it was when you were milking twice a day. And in those cases, usually, because like when summer comes, then he's home all the time. he goes back to twice a day milking, and their supply does go up again.
So one goat, and I know, I mean, it's going to vary from goat to goat, but on average, how much milk would you anticipate getting from a single goat?
So it depends on the breed. And so the reason we have Nigerian dwarfs is for the butter fat, because we're not big milk drinkers. Actually, we don't drink milk. Like we love cheese. And so that's why we got Nigerians, because their butter fat is so high, but they don't produce as much milk. So the textbooks will tell you, that Nigerians average about a quart a day, but that's like the average. So they give birth, and as the kids' demand increases and they're growing faster, they will wind up producing more. So they usually peak at around 6 to 8 weeks. And my very best milkers have peaked at around 3 quarts a day.
Oh, wow.
And then it just gradually, after 8 weeks, it gradually starts to go down. And that quart a day is where a lot of them just kind of settle. And like, that's what they produce for a really long time. Like we've had goats produce for like 2 or 3 years. And then we've got, when we had La Manchas though, like your standard size goats will produce a lot more. Like we had a La Mancha that, would give a gallon easily, and that's not even a lot for some of the bigger breeds. And I always encourage people that if you want to milk your goats, so number one, you want to make sure they come from a herd that tests for diseases so that they don't have any diseases, and number two, you want to make sure that you buy from somebody who milks their goats, because nobody can tell you that a goat is going to be a good milker unless like at least they've milked the mom,
Right.
I have a friend who had Alpines years ago, and she had an Alpine that gave less milk than my best Nigerian. And it was just like, wow, like that goat should have been somebody's dinner. Like,
right.
It's not
a breeding quality goat.
No, like that goat she's eating twice as much. And she's giving you as the same as my little goat here. And the other thing too is that after my daughters left, I had to decide, like, what are we going to do? Because we don't need all these goats. We don't need all this milk. And we were on milk tests back then. And it was really funny because one time I had a Nigerian and a La Mancha who both gave birth on exactly the same day. And so I was tracking their milk production and their butter fat and all of that. Like I could track them side by side without having to do any math, which was great. And, I looked at Viola, the La Mancha, and I said, why am I feeding you twice as much? I know you're giving me a lot of milk here, but the pounds of butter fat was exactly the same as what that Nigerian was doing. It's like, you just gave me 100 pounds more milk, but exactly the same number of pounds of butter fat as this little goat over here. So basically you're giving me watered down milk, because it's the milk solids that you use for making cheese.
Right.
So that, and we did it, like we even played that out, like we would make cheese with just the La Mancha milk, and the yield would be half as much, which makes sense. Like
right.
La Mancha butter fat averages 3.5%. Nigerian butter fat averages 6.5%.
So definitely more efficient than to raise the Nigerians over the is it La Manchas?
La Manchas, yeah. And so when people are trying to decide on a breed, I ask them, I'm like, well, what is your goal? Somebody called me one time who had a huge family, and she said, we go through 3 gallons of milk a day. And I was like, oh, honey, you do not, I'm sorry. I love Nigerians, but you do not want Nigerians.
Right.
You want to go get some Alpines or Sonnens from like really excellent milking herds. Those goats are going to give you gallons of milk a day that you need because she has such a large family. Her children just drank that much milk. Like she's not even, I'm like, you don't even have anything left over to make cheese with.
And as far as like drinking the milk, I don't know, I've had plenty of goat cheese. I like goat cheese. I don't know, are you a fan of goat cheese or not?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we did when we did the cheese tour one time. We had goat's cheese. I don't think I'm a fan of that.
Mhm.
And did we also have like I think we had kefir?
Kefir?
Kefir. Yeah, it's called kefir. We had goat kefir. I don't think I was a fan of that.
So drinking the goat milk, I don't know if I've ever drank goat milk. As far as people that are like they're like lactose intolerant and they cannot drink cow milk, would goat milk be in the same vein? Would they have the same problems, or would that be something that would be more easily digestible, or how does that play out?
So, a lot of people don't realize there are multiple reasons why you may not be able to drink cow's milk. And if you have a true lactose intolerance, then you cannot drink any mammal's milk because all mammals' milk has lactose in it. It's simply milk sugar.
Okay.
However, a lot of people are actually allergic to cow's milk protein. And if you want to get really complicated, they have a problem with A1 protein, not A2 protein.
Mhm.
And so like you can get really, really deep with this. And so if somebody's not sure, I would suggest that they try. If they don't know exactly what it is that they're reacting to in the cow's milk, there's a very good chance that they can drink goat milk, because if it's an allergy to the protein, goat milk has a completely different protein. The other thing too, some people have trouble digesting milk that has been mechanically homogenized.
Mhm.
And in that case, like just milk fresh from the cow or goat or sheep, all of it would be fine for them because it has not been mechanically homogenized. So there's a lot of different reasons that people can respond negatively to milk.
Mhm. So you talked a little bit about feed. What do you feed your goats? Do you just keep them on pasture, or do you supplement them with, you mentioned feed with more copper in it? Kind of what is your feeding regimen?
So goats are browsers rather than grazers. So if you have, like, they will eat grass. They're intermediate browsers, which you hardly ever hear anybody say that. But that's why goats will eat grass, unlike deer, which are true browsers. Like deer just want the trees and the leaves. Goats will eat grass if they don't have bushes and baby trees available. So that's the ideal for them. And then if they are in milk, they need some type of grain. And the thing is, so if you really feel very, very strongly about having like completely forage fed milk, you're better off going with cows, because you can do that with cows. There are several breeds of heritage cows that do great on just grass.
Mhm.
If you try, which I did, if you try to not feed grain to goats, they will wind up insanely skinny at this point in time. Yes, ruminants, really, grain is not ideal for them because the rumen can have challenges with grain. But the thing is, with modern dairy goats, they have been bred to produce so much milk, just by simple, selective breeding, just breeding the best milker to the best milker, that if you don't feed them grain, many of them have such a strong will to milk that they throw all of their energy into the production of milk at the expense of their body. And so they wind up so skinny, and I mean they are just rail thin, and then they're going to start having parasite problems, they're going to have health problems because they're so undernourished. And so that is why most people really need to feed a good goat grain. In addition to that, it is really, really important that they have a mineral. We've
Mhm.
also raised cattle and sheep and llamas and all these other animals. And, honestly, it kind of seems like the minerals for them are like, oh, it's a nice idea. If you forget about it, if it goes, not a big deal. Goats have a really, really high need for minerals. It is not optional.
Mhm.
Like you have to keep that mineral feeder there's got to be something in it all the time. You don't want them to run out. If they do, and you put it out there, they're going to be gobbling at it like they're starving because and that's because they're browsers, because leaves in trees and weeds and all that, they're actually much higher nutrition, much higher protein than grass is. And so that is why when, if you're just giving if your goats just have grass and then hay in the winter, they really, really need a mineral. And it's unfortunately, a lot of the minerals out there are still not that great. Like they're better than they were 20 years ago. But Sweet Licks Meat Maker and Purina Goat Minerals are two of the very few that I have seen that have enough minerals in them. People send me all the time, like, is this mineral good? And you look at it and you're like, well, you could probably feed it to a wether, but there's not enough, because all of these things are very directly related to specific problems, that goats can have. Like if they are copper deficient, they can have fertility problems. If they're selenium deficient, they can have fertility problems. They can have birthing problems. They may have a retained placenta. So,
and those are some of those same things hold true even with the pigs. If they have mineral deficiencies, then they're going to have problems in the same vein, that's definitely more in my wheelhouse there. And I think that would be really true with a lot of animals. If they're not in optimal health, they're going to have birthing problems. They're going to be, they're going to have a lot more health problems because their immune system is not up to snuff. So if at this point, Bonnie, have we convinced you that you should get goats?
No, but talking with you, it's awesome to learn about the goats. And I think if I ever were, but not in the near future, to get a goat, I don't think I would get a meat goat. I mean, he would say, get a meat goat, because anything on this farm, like, we have to eat it. So I think the thing for me is, like, I would get too attached and I wouldn't be able to eat it. Because there's when you get into the goats and the llamas and, all that, it becomes different than the pigs and the chickens. And, it's a little different there. So I would want to get strictly dairy goats if I ever got goats.
So dairy's the way to go if you want to hold on.
But if you wanted to, I'll take care of the meat goat and you take care of the dairy goat, you don't have to be around for the slaughtering. Maybe we could make a compromise, but yeah, you wouldn't be eating my goat. That's what I'm saying.
So if somebody is wanting to get into goats, and obviously they're going to need to make the determination as to whether or not they want meat goats or they want, kind of the direction that they want to go. If they're looking for milk, how much milk they're wanting to get. So all of those things are going to factor into the decision-making process. But if somebody's getting into goats for the first time ever, how would you recommend that they approach it? Should they go down to the local livestock sale and buy a couple of goats and bring them home and try them out?
Definitely not.
I kind of had a feeling that would be your suggestion. And by the way, I feel that way, having been now doing this for a few years. I feel that way about all kinds of livestock. I will not buy at where I do not know the source of those animals, the pedigree of those animals, even chickens. I don't want somebody else's problems.
Right. Exactly.
So with goats, then we're not going down to the livestock auction and buying somebody's cast-offs.
Right.
On the other hand, I don't know, as people, even with pigs, I don't recommend that people necessarily jump in right away with an entire breeding program. So what's kind of a happy medium there from the standpoint of goats?
Well, I think it's a great idea to start with a couple wethers, if you're not really sure, because that's a very low risk, they're very easy to take care of. It's like 5 minutes in the morning and 5 minutes in the evening to dump their water bucket and give them clean water and, make sure that they're okay. and to get them from a reputable breeder. That's also a really great way to get to know breeders, because nobody should be selling all of their bucks as bucks. Like, I do not sell bucks out of first fresheners because I have no idea what kind of production she's going to have. Really, a very small percentage of bucks should be allowed to keep their testicles. Like, the rest of them should be castrated and sold as pets or brush eaters or meat. And so that's a great way to get to know a breeder in your area. Most serious goat breeders have websites. So if you search for your breed of goat along with your state, or if you're in a really big state, like Texas or something, maybe search for the region or a city or something like that. If you get a ton of hits, I don't know. I haven't searched for that, but like whatever breed, if you decided you wanted to get some Saanens in Texas, search for Saanens in Texas, and that should pull up the websites of people who raise that breed in your state.
And
there are.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to.
Oh, you can also, people don't usually want to do this for pets, but once you get into breeding, if you want to get really good goats, like I got all of my goats so far came from out of state. As far away as Alaska,
Oh, wow.
My daughter was very upset when we got the goat from Alaska, because she's like, I've never been on a plane and we have a goat now that's been on a plane.
Nice. So even if you're buying wethers, would you say that it's important for you to make sure that they're coming from a herd that's been tested to ensure that they're not introducing those diseases that you were talking about?
Yeah, the biggest one there would be for the yonis, because that's the one that can survive on pasture for 5 years.
Okay, so you'd want to definitely make sure at a minimum that that it's been tested for yonis. Like coming from a herd
that the whole herd has been tested for yonis. Because a single test on a single animal, because it can take a while for them to seroconvert. A single test on a single animal it's better than nothing, certainly, but it's much better it's much better to go, oh yeah, this herd has been raising goats for 10 years and has had negative yonis tests for 10 years.
Okay. So babe, a wether is maybe in our future. No, you said dairy goats. If we're getting goats, we're getting dairy goats. So then we'd have to jump in whole hog here. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I've really enjoyed this. I've learned a lot because, again, this is out of my wheelhouse. I've never raised goats. Her family raised goats. She doesn't really remember it.
Just remember them crawling all over everything. I mean, just, yeah, all over the place. I mean, I don't even think they're pastured. I mean, ours were. My uncle's, when he lived next door, and his goats, like, they just were all over the place.
Yeah.
And so wherever we would play, I mean, there'd be goat droppings, like, all over the place. So
maybe it makes sense why you don't like goats then. Maybe it wasn't so much the goats and it was poor herd management. So
yeah,
the goats got a bad rap, and it wasn't even the goat's fault. Maybe we'll have to have a talk with Uncle Willie and Dad.
Sounds like you had some fencing issues there.
Yeah, probably.
So
we could talk about some of the fencing issues there, and Uncle Willie's horse that used to come down and eat mom's flowers, but we won't go there. So, well, again, thank you very much for joining us. If people want to find out more about goats and more about, because your podcast is all about goats, you've written a book on goats. So where can they find more information?
My website, thriftyhomesteader.com, has 150 articles about goats. My podcast, For the Love of Goats, I think I'm up to like 46 episodes. And I interview vet professors, ruminant nutritionists, all sorts of different experts on there. And I have online courses, and I pretty much am doing everything, because I want to be able to reach people however they prefer to learn best, whether they want to listen to podcasts or read books or take online classes, watching videos. I think I got all the bases covered.
And speaking of books, you did write a book, Raising Goats Naturally, and that is available on Amazon.
It's available everywhere. It's in a lot of libraries also. And they can also buy it through my website if they want an autographed copy.
There we go. Autographed copy is always a beautiful thing, and it's great to support people directly. I believe strongly in that. So I will have all of the links to all of this in the show notes. So definitely check that out. And Deborah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has been so much fun.
I've enjoyed it as well.
Brian can be reached by emailing him at brian@thehomesteadjourney.net or by contacting him via our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support this podcast, we invite you to become a member of the Supporting Listeners program. For $10 a month or $100 per year, you will receive access to a community of like-minded individuals via a private Facebook group, at least one monthly live Q&A with Brian, the opportunity to participate in live recordings of the podcast, access to an ever-expanding library of helpful homesteading content, and so much more. Head on over to support.thehomesteadjourney.net for more information and to sign up today. As always, the music on this episode was provided by audionautics.com, so a big shout out to them.
And until next time, everybody, keep up the good work.